Imagine walking through a factory on its final day. The machines on one last time. Workers sign their names on sheet metal that will never be replicated. A car, the very last of its kind, rolls toward the shipping dock, carrying with it an entire company's dreams, failures, and legacy. Today, that car is worth millions. Tomorrow, the factory gates close forever. Over 1,300 American car companies have vanished into history. Most people can't name 10 of them, but each one died with a final heartbeat. One last vehicle that became an automotive tombstone. Some were masterpieces. Others were disasters. A few were never even finished. This is the story of how empires end. Not with explosions, but with silence. Not with glory, but with unsold inventory and locked factory doors. My goal in this video is to trace the final moments of 22 American car brands that rolled their last vehicle off the line and disappeared forever. Let's begin. First, we'll step into the 1950s and the name Airway. While Detroit was building land yachts with tail fins, a small California company called Airway asked a radical question. What if we built cars with just enough? Born in the aftermath of World War II, Airway didn't compete with the giants. They built something completely different. Ultra-lightweight vehicles stripped to bare essentials. Between 1949 and 1950, they produced exactly two models, the Vicinity and the Traveler. Both featured aluminum bodies, air-cooled engines producing a mere 10.6 horsepower, and construction so simple a mechanic could understand them in minutes. These weren't cars for highway cruising. They were philosophical statements on wheels, built for a transitioning economy that still remembered wartime rationing. But America was hungry for excess, not efficiency. With no assembly lines and no dealer network, Airway vanished as quickly as it appeared. Next is Keller. George Keller had a vision that seemed almost un-American for its time: build fewer cars, but make each one extraordinary. Operating from Alabama, Keller Motor Corporation focused on large, luxurious vehicles carrying the handcrafted spirit of the American South. Their crowning achievement and final product was the Keller Super Chief, a wood-bodied station wagon assembled by hand in numbers so small they barely qualify as production. Across their entire existence, Keller completed fewer than 20 cars total. Each one was a rolling work of art, a rejection of mass production philosophy. Then in 1949, George Keller died suddenly. He was the company's visionary, financier, and chief engineer all in one. Without him, there was no Keller. The doors closed quietly. Playboy Motor Car Corporation was one of the boldest yet most fragile projects of post-war America. Founded in Buffalo, New York, Playboy targeted young Americans who wanted European sportiness with American practicality. The retractable hardtop was mechanical poetry, complex, expensive, and utterly impractical for a startup with limited capital. While most American cars still use traditional soft tops, Playboy was engineering a future that the market wasn't ready to pay for. From 1947 to 1951, approximately 97 Playboys were completed, plus several prototypes. The final recorded vehicle never even made it to completion. It left the factory unfinished. A perfect metaphor for a company that dreamed bigger than its bank account allowed. Crosley was a rare case in American automotive history. Small, inexpensive, yet remarkably bold in its engineering. Powell Crosley Jr. built radios, refrigerators, and a baseball stadium. But his most ambitious project was proving that Americans didn't need massive cars to live well. Founded in Ohio, Crosley Motors focused on lightweight, economical vehicles when the rest of Detroit was supersizing everything. What made Crosley remarkable wasn't just its size, it was its engineering ambition. In 1949, Crosley became the first American manufacturer to introduce disc brakes into mass production, a technology that major automakers wouldn't widely adopt for decades. The system had durability issues, but it proved that small didn't mean simple-minded. Crosley's final models, the CD sedan, VC Hot Shot, and Supersports rolled off the line in 1952. When Crosley shut down, America lost a manufacturer willing to experiment, just as the market was consolidating around giants. Next is Glass Bar. Before Corvette, before the fiberglass sport car revolution, there was Glasspar, a California boat builder that decided to see if the same materials that made lightweight hulls could create lightweight car bodies. The Glasspar G2 is often cited as the first mass-produced fiberglass sports car in America. Mass-produced is generous. About 100 were built, depending on how you count incomplete bodies sold as kits. Lightweight, low-slung, and European in appearance, the G2 proved that alternative materials could work in automotive construction. The significance wasn't in power. Various engines were offered, none particularly impressive. The significance was that Glasspar demonstrated fiberglass could be molded into complex curves impossible with steel. By 1953, Glasspar returned to building boat hulls, where the money was more reliable. The automotive experiment ended, but its influence rippled forward. Muntz was the embodiment of a bold idea, an American luxury sports car. Earl "Madman" Muntz was already famous for aggressive marketing when he decided to build the most impractical, most luxurious sports car imaginable, the Muntz Jet. Picture a spacious four-seat coupe equipped with leather upholstery, a built-in minibar, high-end radio, and a 160-horsepower Lincoln V8. Priced at $5,500, more than most American cars of the era, the Jet could reach speeds over 110 miles per hour, shocking figures for the early 1950s. Here's the problem. Every single Jet sold lost money. Muntz built cars like luxury goods in an era of mass production economics. Only 198 were completed before Muntz shut down operations in 1954. Clipper was Packard's final attempt to save itself in a market that was changing too fast. Once a successful mid-range line, by 1956, Clipper was spun off as a standalone brand in hopes of attracting younger buyers and competing directly with Buick and Oldsmobile. The 1956 Clipper was technically impressive, powerful V8 engine, modern automatic transmission, styling that reflected post-war optimism. But behind a shiny chrome was a company on life support. The dealer network was collapsing, the factory was running out of cash, and customers knew they were buying from a brand with no future. Approximately 18,500 Clippers were produced in that final year. And with that, we come to the end of the 1950s. Next, we move into the 1960s. First is Edsel. Everyone knows Edsel failed spectacularly in 1958. What most people don't know is that Ford actually tried to save it. They streamlined the lineup, improved quality, and pushed Edsel into the 1960 model year as one final effort. It lasted less than 2 months. The final recorded Edsel was a 9-passenger Villager station wagon, one of only 59 built in that configuration. The controversial horse-collar grille was gone, toned down to blend into the crowd. Edsel had become quiet, subdued, almost forgettable, which is exactly why it failed again. When that last Villager rolled away, it carried the weight of one of history's most expensive lessons.
Before Tesla,
the name Henny
there was
Motor
the Henny
Company
Kilowatt,
follows next.
a 1960
Before
electric
Tesla,
car, visionary
before
but doomed
anyone
by
thought
its
electric
time.
cars could be viable, there was the Henny Kilowatt, one of America's first commercial electric vehicles. Henny was known for ambulances and limousines, but partnering with National Union Electric, they created something remarkable, an electric car based on the Renault Dauphine platform. The final version in 1960 used a 72-volt system offering a top speed of around 60 miles per hour and a driving range of approximately 60 miles. Impressive numbers for 1960. Completely impractical for a country with zero charging infrastructure. The lead-acid batteries were heavy. The costs were astronomical. Only 47 kilowatt cars were sold before Henny abandoned electric vehicles. The dream was right. The timing was catastrophically wrong. Another name represents a
rating one, the
characteristic
Renault
of the
Quarry.
1960s, combining Italian design with American power. International Motor Cars had a perfect formula. Take stunning Italian design from Intermeccanica, combine it with a powerful Buick V8, and sell it to Americans who wanted European sophistication. The Apollo GT, also known as the Apollo 5000 GT, looked like it belonged on the Riviera. Under the hood sat a Buick 215 cubic inch V8 producing around 225 horsepower, more than enough to embarrass most European sports cars of the era. Reality told a different story. High prices, weak dealer networks, and tiny production volumes meant the Apollo was invisible to most buyers. Only 80 to 90 were built before International Motor Cars shut down in 1964. Next is Studebaker. Beginning in 1852 with horse-drawn wagons, Studebaker entered the automotive era earlier than most competitors and once stood as a symbol of durability and innovation. But by the mid-1960s, competitive pressure from the Big Three, high production costs, and a weakened dealer network pushed Studebaker to the brink. The final day came at the Hamilton, Canada plant in 1966. The last recorded Studebaker was a four-door cruiser painted timberline turquoise, powered by a Chevrolet 283 V8, not even their own engine anymore. When that cruiser rolled off the line, Studebaker closed the book on 114 years of history, leaving a deep void in the memory of Americans who once believed in independent automotive brands. And with that, the 1960s came to an end, and now we move in the 1970s, a decade defined by the oil crisis and the earliest experiments with electric vehicles. The name that represents this era is Sebring Vanguard. The 1973 oil crisis changed everything. Into this chaos stepped Sebring Vanguard with the Citycar, a wedge-shaped electric vehicle that looked like a doorstop on wheels. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't fast, top speed was around 40 miles per hour. But it required no gasoline and no internal combustion engine, exactly what the just-enough mentality of the 1970s demanded. The aluminum body was thin, the two-seat interior was basic, but for urban transportation during an energy crisis, it was perfectly adequate. The final version was the City Van, a stretched variant so rare that only about 11 units were produced. By 1977, Sebring Vanguard shut down and was sold to commuter vehicles. Another bold name emerged in this decade. Malcolm Bricklin promised to build the safety vehicle, a sports car that prioritized protection in the post-oil crisis era. The Bricklin SV1 was shocking on first glance. Body panels were made of color-infused acrylic requiring no paint, mounted on a steel frame. The gull-wing doors opened via hydraulic systems that frequently failed. Under the hood sat a fuel-hungry Ford 351 V8, completely contradicting the efficiency narrative of the era. Priced higher than a Corvette, plagued by inconsistent build quality, and burdened by operating costs that spiraled out of control, Bricklin lasted just 2 years. Approximately 3,000 SV1s were produced before the experiment collapsed. Opening the 1980s, we have International Harvester. Born from tractors, trucks, and agricultural equipment, International Harvester entered the passenger vehicle market with a different philosophy. Simple, durable, and ready for hard work. The vehicle that marked the end was the Scout II, an off-road SUV that existed before the term SUV became common. On October 21, 1980, the final Scout II rolled off the production line. It was equipped with a Nissan turbo diesel engine and a 4-speed manual transmission, a practical, no-frills configuration. There was no farewell ceremony, no final advertising campaign. International Harvester withdrew from passenger vehicles to focus entirely on heavy trucks and industrial equipment. Next, Renault's presence in the U.S. market did not end in bankruptcy, but in a calculated withdrawal. After years of partnership with AMC, Renault gradually realized that American buyers wanted something French brands struggled to provide. The final car officially sold bearing the Renault badge was the Renault Medallion, the Americanized version of the Renault 21. It was a front-wheel drive sedan with conservative styling, focused on ride comfort and fuel efficiency, everything Americans claimed they wanted in theory but rejected in practice. When Renault sold its entire stake in AMC to Chrysler in 1987, the Renault name vanished from U.S. showrooms. The Medallion became the Eagle Medallion after just a single model year. The final name of the 1980s belongs to Merkur. This was Ford's ambitious attempt to bring the spirit of European cars into the U.S. market. Instead of creating a new brand from scratch, Ford imported European models directly and sold them under the Merkur name, a brand that existed only in the United States. The car that marked the end was the Merkur Scorpio, a large sedan equipped with a 2.9-liter V6 engine, rear-wheel drive, and a focus on comfort and technology rather than performance. With a high price tag, distinctly European styling, and complex electrical systems, the Scorpio quickly struggled to find acceptance. By 1989, Ford quietly discontinued Merkur. Moving into the 1990s, we come to Stutz. Revived in 1968, Stutz pursued a neoclassical path, luxurious, flamboyant, and unwilling to compromise with mainstream tastes. The company's final car was the Stutz Bearcat II, a two-seat roadster based on the Pontiac Firebird chassis, powered by a 300-horsepower LT1 V8. But the Bearcat II wasn't built to compete on performance numbers. It was created for a very small group of buyers who wanted a new car with the soul of the 1930s. Adjusted for today's value, its price exceeded $400,000, effectively placing Stutz outside the broader market. Only around 13 Bearcat IIs were built before the company shut down in 1995. Excalibur was one of the rare automakers to survive for 3 decades without ever trying to become modern. Founded in 1965, Excalibur pursued a single idea, recreating the glamour of the 1928 Mercedes-Benz SSK, but built on American mechanical foundations. Excalibur cars used chassis and engines from Chevrolet and other GM platforms, but were clothed in pre-war-inspired bodywork with exposed fenders, an upright grille, and lavish interiors. These weren't cars for driving enthusiasts, they were rolling statements, nostalgia made tangible. Over 30 years, Excalibur produced approximately 3,500 cars, a remarkable number by neoclassical standards. In 1997, when the final Excalibur left the factory, it closed the final chapter of a lifestyle built entirely on memory. Next is Eagle, born from the ashes of AMC as Chrysler's attempt to preserve a youthful, sporty spirit within an increasingly homogenized corporate system. The final car of the brand was the Eagle Talon, a sports coupe co-developed with Mitsubishi Eclipse. The most memorable version, the TSI AWD, used a turbocharged 4G63 engine, all-wheel drive, and produced up to 210 horsepower, enough to challenge many larger, more powerful American cars. But declining sales, the absorption of Eagle dealers into the Chrysler-Plymouth network, and product overlap with Dodge rendered Eagle redundant. In 1998, only about 4,300 Talons were produced before Eagle was officially discontinued. Moving into the 2000s, we come to a name that once served as the gateway for millions of Americans into the world of automobiles. Affordable, accessible, and unpretentious, Plymouth existed for decades as the quintessential first-car brand. But by the end of the 20th century, that role had become redundant within Chrysler's own lineup. The car that marked the end was the 2001 Plymouth Neon, a compact front-wheel drive sedan, practical and entirely ordinary. No more V8s, no distinct identity. At this point, Plymouth was little more than a different badge on rebadged Dodge vehicles. The reason for its termination was clear declining sales, internal product overlap, and Daimler Chrysler's brand streamlining strategy. On June 28, 2001, the final Plymouth rolled off the production line, closing a proud era. Next is Oldsmobile, once one of the most important names in Detroit. Founded in 1897, Oldsmobile was not only older than most of its competitors, but also once stood as a symbol of innovation, performance, and America's rising middle class. But by the early 2000s, Oldsmobile no longer had a clear position within the General Motors lineup. Sales were declining, products overlapped with Chevrolet and Pontiac, and the brand gradually lost its connection with younger buyers. GM chose to bring Oldsmobile to an orderly, controlled end. In 2004, the company released the final 500 series across its remaining models. The last car was the Oldsmobile Alero GLS Final 500, finished in dark cherry metallic and powered by a 3.4-liter V6. The car bore the signatures of factory workers and marked the closing of 107 years of history. Finally, closing out the 2000s, we come to Avanti, a name that never quite allowed itself to die. Born from Studebaker's bold 1962 design, Avani continued to exist for decades through a series of ownership changes, relocations, and mechanical platforms. Yet it always retained its familiar silhouette. By the early 2000s, Avani had become a very small-scale automaker, hand-assembling cars in extremely limited numbers. The final Avanis were built in Mexico using the Ford Mustang GT platform, powered by a strong V8 engine, but wrapped in a body design already more than 40 years old. In 2006, when the last Avani left the factory, there was no press release and no official farewell. Avani disappeared the same way it had existed for half a century, on the margins of the industry for a small group of people who still believe that design could be timeless. 22 automakers, 22 different endings, yet all of them lead to the same moment. The last car rolling off the production line. It wasn't always a masterpiece. Often it was just an ordinary sedan, a coupe few people remember, or even an unfinished project. But each one represented the final heartbeat of an entire company, the moment when ambition, dreams, and decades of work became automotive history. If you grew up with these brands, saw them in driveways, in garages, or on the roads of America, then this story is part of your own memory as well. If you'd like to continue this journey, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and leave a comment about the car or brand you remember most. See you next time. Adjusted for today's value, its price exceeded $400,000, effectively placing Stutz outside the broader automotive market entirely. Only around 13 Bearcat Tous were built before the company shut down in 1995. Each one was a statement piece, a rejection of modern automotive design philosophy, and a car that made no economic sense whatsoever. Which was exactly the point. Excalibur survived for 3 decades without ever trying to become modern. Founded in 1965, the company pursued one singular idea: recreate the glamour of the 1928 Mercedes-Benz SSK using American mechanical foundations. Excalibur cars used chassis and engines from Chevrolet and other GM platforms, clothed in pre-war-inspired bodywork with exposed fenders, upright grilles, and lavish interiors. These weren't cars for driving enthusiasts. They were rolling statements, nostalgia made tangible, classic looks that could still be registered with modern license plates. Over 30 years, Excalibur produced approximately 3,500 cars, a remarkable number by neoclassical standards. In 1997, when the final Excalibur left the factory, it closed the final chapter of a lifestyle built entirely on memory in a world racing toward the future. Excalibur proved you could survive by living in the past, but eventually, even nostalgia runs out of customers. Born from AMC's ashes, Eagle was Chrysler's attempt to preserve a youthful, sporty spirit within an increasingly homogenized corporate structure. For a decade, Eagle existed in a strange middle ground. Not quite premium, not quite economy, not quite sure what it wanted to be. The final car of the brand was the Eagle Talon, a sports coupe co-developed with Mitsubishi Eclipse. The most memorable version, the TSI AWD, used a turbocharged 4G63 engine, all-wheel drive, and produced up to 210 horsepower. It was genuinely quick, genuinely fun, and genuinely competitive with much more expensive performance cars. But declining sales, dealer consolidation into the Chrysler-Plymouth network, and product overlap with Dodge made Eagle redundant. In 1998, only about 4,300 Talons were produced before Eagle was officially discontinued. The brand ended not with failure, but with irrelevance, which is somehow worse. For decades, Plymouth served as the entry point for millions of Americans into car ownership. Affordable, accessible, unpretentious, Plymouth was the quintessential first car brand. But by the end of the 20th century, that role had become completely redundant within Chrysler's own lineup. The car that marked the end was the 2001 Plymouth Neon, a compact front-wheel drive sedan that was practical and entirely ordinary. No V8S, no distinct identity, no reason to exist. At this point, Plymouth was little more than a different badge on rebadged Dodge vehicles. The reason for termination was brutally simple: declining sales, internal product overlap, and Daimler Chrysler's brand streamlining strategy. On June 28, 2001, the final Plymouth rolled off the production line. There was no ceremony, no tribute, no acknowledgement of the millions of Americans whose first car wore that badge. Plymouth ended with a whimper, erased from history by spreadsheet logic. Oldsmobile was one of Detroit's oldest and most important names. Founded in 1897, it stood as a symbol of innovation, performance, and America's rising middle class for over a century. But by the early 2000s, Oldsmobile had lost its identity within the General Motors empire. Sales were declining. Products overlapped with Chevrolet and Pontiac. The brand had no clear positioning and no connection with younger buyers. GM made the decision to bring Oldsmobile to an orderly, controlled end, the automotive equivalent of a dignified retirement. In 2004, the company released a final 500 series across its remaining models. The very last car was an Oldsmobile Alero GLS Final 500, finished in dark cherry metallic and powered by a 3.4-liter V6. Factory workers signed the body panels, a small but meaningful gesture acknowledging that 107 years of history was ending. When that Alero left the factory, it closed the book on one of America's oldest continuous automotive brands. Oldsmobile didn't fail. It was strategically eliminated, which somehow feels more tragic than bankruptcy. Avanti was born from Studebaker's bold 1962 design and somehow continued to exist for decades through ownership changes, relocations, and mechanical platform swaps. The one constant? That distinctive silhouette, a shape that refused to be forgotten. By the early 2000s, Avanti had become a micro-scale manufacturer, hand-assembling cars in extremely limited numbers. The final Avantis were built in Mexico using Ford Mustang GT platforms, powerful V8 engines wrapped in a body design already more than 40 years old. In 2006, when the last Avanti left the factory, there was no press release, no official farewell, no ceremony. Avanti disappeared the same way it had existed for half a century. On the margins of the industry, for a small group of people who believed that design could be timeless even when the car company itself was not. 22 automakers. 22 different endings. Yet all of them lead to the same moment. The last car rolling off the production line. It wasn't always a masterpiece. Often it was just an ordinary sedan, a coupe few people remember, or even an unfinished project gathering dust in a corner of the factory. But each one represented the final heartbeat of an entire company, the moment when ambition, dreams, and decades of work became automotive history. Some died from competition, others from miscalculation, a few from simply existing at the wrong time with the right idea. But every single one proves the same brutal truth. In the automotive industry, being good isn't enough. Being innovative isn't enough. Even being right isn't enough. You have to be good, innovative, right, and commercially viable. You need timing, distribution, financing, and often just pure luck. Without all of these elements aligned, you become another name on the list of companies that once built cars in America and don't anymore. If you grew up with these brands, saw them in driveways, in garages on American roads, then this story is part of your own memory. These aren't just companies that failed. They're time capsules of ambition, evidence that people once believed they could challenge Detroit and win. They were wrong. But the audacity of trying? That's worth remembering.